From a huge new push to restore the Amazon rainforest to a mythical animal that was saved from extinction. I'm your host Regis, and welcome to Good News. Here are 7 stories from all around the world. Let's start with some fantastic news in the United States, where a new drug policy will guarantee affordable medicine for many. To stop medicine prices from surging too high, the US government wants to put in place a bold new policy. Patents are at the center of the pharmaceutical industry, accounting for around 80% of its revenue. Whenever a new drug is developed, the manufacturer has at least 20 years to enjoy exclusive rights. After that, the competitors can develop generic versions of their own medicine, meaning there's more choice and prices naturally come down. But now, the Biden administration wants to install new measures to make sure that drugs don't become too expensive in the meantime. Policy framework released in December is designed to keep medicine or medical products created with government assistance affordable. If not, the government will have the power to march in and override patents. This would mean redistributing the patents to other companies to reduce the price. However you feel about that, the prices would go down. Recently, pharmaceutical companies have been criticized as exploiting patents and charging high prices on essential medicines. The CEO of Moderna, for example, the pharmaceutical giant that developed one of the COVID-19 vaccines, was called to testify before Congress to answer for their pricing strategy. The manufacturer had planned to raise the price of the vaccine from $26 to $130 per dose, an increase of over 400%. Other drugs like chemotherapy medicine carboplatin have skyrocketed to 10 times their regular price during supply shortages. One survey found that about 18 million people couldn't afford to pay for medicine that had been prescribed to them by a doctor. Americans with low income are the most affected by drug prices, so the march-in policy would guarantee that many drugs stay affordable for this group. Moving on to our next story, in which a commercial aircraft has become the first to cross the Atlantic using completely sustainable jet fuel. Aviation makes up around 2% of all carbon dioxide emissions every year, and it's not hard to see why. A return trip from London to New York creates almost 2.2 metric tons of CO2 per passenger. That's equal to driving a car almost 22,000 kilometers. For example, if you drove from Kazakhstan all the way to Sweden and then down to the bottom of Africa, you'd still have some gas left in the tank. To make a change to the damaging aviation industry, Virgin Atlantic turned to sustainable fuels. This kind of fuel is made up of textiles, food waste, fats, and used cooking oils, all things that were heading for the landfill anyway. To be honest, the idea of flying on pizza crusts and banana peels is a little strange to me, but hey, if it's saving the planet, I'm all for it. Besides, Virgin has now proved that using these kinds of fuels can actually be viable for air travel. The company reached a major milestone with the successful journey of Flight VS-100, a Boeing 787 flying from London to New York. It's the first ever sustainable transatlantic airplane flight in history, bringing the carbon emissions from tons down to 0. And as the cherry on top, Virgin's sustainable program is even being supported by the United Kingdom's government as part of its objective to reach net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. So in the future, there could be incentives from across the pond too, as sustainable aviation fuels will soon be eligible for tax credits in the United States. Now, let's shift to exciting news coming out of the medical world, where scientists have found a way to predict which organs will be the first to fail. In a study carried out by Stanford Medicine, the health markers of over 5,500 people were analyzed. The team fed data from 11 vital organs into a machine learning program to create a powerful predictive tool. It compared the biological age with chronological age, drawn from protein levels found in the blood. For instance, you might be 30 years old, but due to genetics and lifestyle, the biological age of your liver could be 50, as it's aging more rapidly than the rest of your body. Chances are, even if it's not your liver, there's something that needs to be monitored. The program found that almost 1 in 5 people aged over 50 had one organ that stuck out, aging much quicker than the others, despite the participants being considered healthy. It could now be possible to detect which part of the body is at risk before it actually shows any signs of disease. If an organ is flagged as accelerated aging, it puts the person at a 50% higher mortality risk in the following decade and a half. This includes the brain, where accelerated aging is a strong predictor of Alzheimer's. The bottom line is that in the future, a doctor could use a simple blood sample to determine which organ needs to be treated before developing a life-threatening illness. Our next story comes from South America, in Ecuador, where a monumental legal decision is handing indigenous people their land back. Covering a landmass of over 500,000 acres over Ecuador and Peru, the Pequea has been inhabited by the Siacopai people for hundreds of years. But after a war between the two countries in the 1940s, this indigenous group was driven out of their land. Ever since, oil companies, governments, and other private interests have continued to displace and fracture the Siacopai community. As a consequence, their population has dropped into the hundreds, now standing as low as 800. But for more than 8 decades, the Siacopai have been fighting in court to reclaim their land through lawsuits against both countries. Now, the Siacopai have finally achieved their first landmark win in Peru. A court ruling has reinstated their ownership of 104,000 acres of land, about twice the size of Austria's capital, Vienna. Siacopai leaders have described it as a historic moment in recognizing their ties to the sacred territory. This landmark decision could open the floodgates for a wave of other indigenous peoples to claim land back. 14 different recognized groups in the Pequea area and hundreds around the world will be able to use this case in their own legal battles. Guarding the land is one thing, but protecting an entire species is another task altogether. Which takes us to our next story over in Africa, where a mythical-looking animal has been saved from the brink of extinction. The scimitar-horned oryx has to be seen to be believed. Resembling more of a mythical creature than an earthly animal, it has long, almost metallic horns curving from the top of its head, a thin white coat, and a muscular four-legged body. Kind of like a fusion between a horse, a unicorn, and a deer, the scimitar-horned oryx was long thought to be extinct. It first appeared in Western science in the early 19th century, observed in the northern African countries of Niger, Chad, and Tunisia. Over the following 2 centuries, population numbers dropped dramatically until the year 2000, when the species was declared extinct in the wild. Since then, conservationists from hundreds of institutions have worked carefully to breed the species in captivity. Their hard work has now paid off, as the scimitar-horned oryx has been upgraded to the status of endangered. While that might not sound like an update, it's a heck of a lot better than extinct. There are now more than 600 scimitar-horned oryxes in the wild, mostly located in a protected reserve in Chad. Our next story comes from Europe, where strong new laws will help reduce the negative impact of big corporations. A lack of regulation around corporations has been a deepening issue for governments all around the world for a while now. From workers' rights to ecological damage, policing companies has been virtually impossible. When their supply chains are scattered across the globe, it's been nearly impossible for national governments to enforce their local labor laws in these other countries. As an example, sectors like the cocoa industry have long been linked to forced labor. In 2018, almost 1.5 million children were working in the cocoa industry in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana alone, 2 of the global centers of cocoa production. Now, the EU is hoping to change that with a new set of laws. The directive, we'll do you the favor of not mentioning its full name, will evaluate large companies on their impact in a variety of areas: biodiversity, pollution, and labor practices. Thus, over 13,000 companies operating within the European Union will be monitored and, if necessary, punished when violating human rights standards at any point in their supply chain. That way, corporate entities are being held accountable for the impact of their actions, even when those effects are felt far away. In our final story, the effects of this government measure will hopefully be felt across the globe, as Brazil has committed over $200 million to restore the Amazon rainforest. For millions of years, the rainforest has acted as a carbon sink by absorbing CO2 emissions, including man-made pollution that drives climate change. This is why there's been a renewed focus on protecting the world's largest rainforest from being destroyed. Since the 1990s, over 18,000 square kilometers of the Amazon rainforest have been disappearing every single year. About 2/3 of it lies within Brazilian territory, and for years, the damage was accelerating rather than slowing down. That was until January of last year, when newly elected President Lula da Silva committed to stopping deforestation and restarting reforestation efforts. During the COP28 climate summit later that year, he doubled down on his promise, unveiling a grand plan to reach zero deforestation by 2030. The first step of the program commits $205 million, which will help restore nearly 60,000 square kilometers to the forest. To wrap your head around the size of that, that's bigger than Croatia, a country home to almost 4 million people. And this brings us to the end of another episode. Have any good news stories caught your attention recently? And which of our stories are you the the most excited about? Let us know in the comments down below. We're really excited to hear what you think. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll be back with more good news next week.